Mystic Post TV. Bill McIntosh with guest Patrick Novecosky. Now, you may be wondering, who is Patrick Novecosky? Well, he's one of those unique individuals who was able to meet the Pope 5 times, kiss his ring 4 times, which, of course, begs the question, how can we kiss it 5 times? But we'll let him answer that a little shortly. But he's one of America's most accomplished Catholic communicators. He's author of the book, 100 Ways John Paul II Changed the World, and has won more than 24 awards from the Catholic Press Association. He has edited and written for some of America's top Catholic publications and has been published in 5 languages. He's managing partner of Nova Media, a public relations firm specializing in the Catholic space. He previously served as Legatus Magazine's editor-in-chief for 12 years. He's traveled to 26 countries. And like I said, he met the Pope 5 times. He's a lucky guy. And he made Pope Francis laugh out loud. We'll get into that too, hopefully. But most importantly, he's husband and father of 5 beautiful. He's a husband and father of 5 beautiful children. Well, Patrick, welcome to Mystic Post TV. How are you doing today?
Doing well, Bill. Good to be with you.
Likewise. Well, let me ask you. I understand you're from Saskatchewan.
Grew up in Saskatchewan, absolutely.
Right. But now you're in Florida?
Yes.
Do you have anything against snow?
Well, I always say that snow is like grandchildren. It's nice to visit, but it's also really good just to go home and leave it behind.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. You have to change diapers, among other things, So
yeah.
Anyway, well, Patrick, didn't your grandfather?
No. I aspire to be one day.
All right. Well, God willing, it won't happen. Sure. Well, listen, you were so kind to send me a copy of the book, like a PDF, and the million-dollar question is, where does one start? But fortunately, we had a couple of questions that you and Stephen Ryan helped me with. There's so many good things in there. But first, is how did you get to meet St. John Paul II 5 times?
Yeah, well, obviously that it's God's providence. So I'll make the long story short. But in the fall of 1996, I started working for the Marian Fathers, Marians of the Immaculate Conception in Stockbridge, Massachusetts. They operate the Marian Helper Center and the National Shrine of the Divine Mercy. I was associate editor and writer for the Marian Helper magazine, and a pretty new face for the 100 or so employees that the Marians have. Back in the 90s, at Christmas time, they would have an employee Christmas party and a raffle, and you'd buy tickets and, the tear-off tickets, and you'd put your name on the back, and all of their vendors would give prizes. It would range from little, snow globe that you shake up and it snows inside to a picture. It was Norman Rockwell's town too, Stockbridge, Massachusetts.
Oh, really?
So there was always the Rockwell Main Street of Stockbridge painting, very famous. But the grand prize back then came from their travel agent. Now, the Marian Fathers are a Polish-Lithuanian order. They've got houses all over the world in at least a dozen countries. At least they did back then. It might be smaller now. But so they used a travel agent for all of their travel, and nobody booked their travel online in those days. So the travel agent gave a pretty big prize. It was a trip for 2 to Cancun. And who wins it but the new kid? So I was 27 or so, 26, 27 years old. And I had just really come back to the faith with my whole heart. And I had no desire to sit on a beach in Cancun. So I called up the travel agent and I said, can I change that ticket to a trip to Rome? And they said, yeah, absolutely. So then word got around the Marian Fathers that the new kid that won the trip, he wants to go to Rome instead. They have a house in Rome, and I was single at the time, so they said, well, why don't you stay at our house in Rome and do some work for us? And the work that they were talking about was that John Paul II had asked the Marian Fathers to lead the re-evangelization of Eastern Europe after the fall of communism. So this is 96. Poland had gotten its freedom in the late 80s, 89. Ukraine and some of the neighboring Slovakia, Czech Republic around 91. So it had only been maybe 5 years for some of those countries that they had free elections. So the Marians had priests behind the Iron Curtain all throughout the Soviet era. And they were hurting. I mean, these were martyrs. These were men who kept the faith and kept the faith alive, kind of like, campfire that's dying and you're blowing on the embers, knowing that one day God's going to give you some wood to build that fire. Well, my job was to go and meet these heroic priests and learn their stories and find out what their needs were. The Marian Helper magazine at that time, probably still, they've got 250,000 readers. So plus they have Marian.org, the DivineMercy.org websites now. So I came back with a ton of stories, and I'll get to that in a second. But my first stop was Rome, and I stayed at the Marian's house. This is the fall of 1997. And the way it worked was John Paul would celebrate his mass in the papal apartments every morning around 7:30. And if there were seats left over, the seats were reserved for bishops and other priests that were in Rome that requested to celebrate the mass with the Holy Father. And if there was a seat available and you're a lay person and you knew somebody on the inside and you get on that list, they would call you the night before and say, you can go see the Holy Father and go to his mass. So I came prepared. I came prepared in a couple of ways. I was praying really hard to Saint Therese, because for the Catholics out there that know, Saint Therese, when she was a young teenager, she went to Rome with her dad. And she went to Rome because she was determined to see the Pope. And she was determined to ask the Pope if she could enter the convent, the Carmel, and join the convent, even though she was too young. So
how old was she then?
She was 15, and she was tenacious, man. I mean, she was scrappy little French girl,
Wow.
And she went to the Pope and she asked him that question. He essentially said, listen to your dad, listen to the superiors, and if it's God's will, but anyway, she met the Pope. So here I am, I'm in Rome, I'm praying to Saint Therese. You met the Pope. Now, can you put in a good word for me? So I'd been in Rome 2 or 3 days. Every time I came back to the monastery, they're like, yeah, no call. Nobody called to say you're going to see the Pope tomorrow. And then one day, it was the last day of September, 1997. I'll never forget it. My brother was with me, and we were going through St. John Lateran in Rome, which is the Pope's basilica, the Pope's cathedral, I should say, in Rome. And there are pictures of St. Therese everywhere. And so I put in another word to St. Therese. It was all in Italian. I couldn't understand a word of it. And there are TV cameras everywhere. And so I'm like, this must be a big deal. So there's a mass there that evening. I gathered that much. But then I went back to the monastery, and the nun that ran the switchboard came looking for me. She was like, they called. You're going to see the Pope tomorrow, and your brother's going with you. And my brothers were like, wait, what? What? The nun answered the phone. They asked her how many, and she said 2. And so my brother came with me. And the next day just happened to be October 1st, which is the feast of Saint Therese of Lisieux.
That's a coincidence.
That little coincidence there. So, and I'm stringing this story out because here's the punchline. I figured this out a couple months later. But the day the prayer was answered, September 30th, 1997, was 100 years to the day that she died.
Oh, my gosh. Like I said, just a coincidence, right?
Just a little coincidence. So on the centenary of her death, which was likely her entry into heaven, she answered the prayer. And then the next day, her feast day, I meet the Pope for the first time. Wow. So that's what set off this chain of events. I was also the webmaster of Marian.org. So what I did, I went to the Mass, celebrate this little chapel. The Pope had his Mass in every morning, 30 people And then after the Mass, they let us out to an adjoining room. And I was the only one of those 30 people that had a gift for the Pope. So I had this white leather folder, gold embossed with his
Wow.
coat of arms. I did
Oh
it
my
up
God.
really nice. I printed out on this glossy paper pages from Marian.org about Divine Mercy, about Faustina, about his writing about Divine Mercy, his authenticating the message of Divine Mercy, and his promoting the cause of Faustina's canonization. So I had 60 seconds standing beside the Vicar of Christ, explaining to him this work and thanking him for his work. And
In Polish?
I was...
Did you say in Polish, Patrick?
I speak a little bit of Polish, but I knew that if I engaged in a conversation in Polish and he asked me a question, that was it. I'd be done. So I stuck to what I know. I stuck to English. But
Okay.
but yeah, so the whole Mass, I stared at him the whole time. I drank in every single second of that Mass and memorized every movement, everything. And then they let us out to this other room where I was to give this presentation to the Pope, and I was nervous. I was really nervous until he entered the room. When he entered the room, all that anxiety, it was out the window. It's like I'm standing beside my dad or my best friend. I mean, it was that easy.
Wow. He's
And,
amazing, huh? People have said that. I've heard somebody say that. I heard this one guy when I lived in Colombia that he said that he was there, just a kind of a important civic leader, and not a very religious guy, but he said it was like electricity. It was unbelievable, the experience.
yeah, when he walked in the room, when I walked in the room and I saw him kneeling in front of the tabernacle in his chapel for the first time, my first time I laid eyes on him, my heart literally jumped in my chest. It was a amazing experience that I've never experienced before. So that was my first meeting with Pope, fall of '97, because the CFO of the Marian Fathers pulled my name out of a drum and led to this. So then I went all through Eastern Europe. I went to 5 countries in 6 weeks. I was at 7 countries in 6 weeks. I spent 6 weeks in Europe, gathering all
Which
these
year?
articles. 97, fall of 97. The entire month of October 97, I was in Europe. And I came back with all these stories, spent a year kind of unpacking this stuff and writing about it for the Marians magazine. And they were really successful. People responded with great generosity to the needs of these priests and seminarians in Eastern Europe. And so my boss was like, well, this is a big hit. We're going to send you back there again in 98. So fall of 98, I went back to Rome, met John Paul again, went through Eastern Europe again, wrote some stories. 99 rolled around, and John Paul was going to Poland, and the Marian Fathers have this huge shrine in central Poland. It's called Our Lady of Lichen, L-I-C-H-E-N. And the big shrine church was under construction. It was almost finished, and John Paul stopped. He blessed the construction site, and this is not an audience, but I was with about 100 priests and seminarians gathered around John Paul II. He was leaning out the window of his Pope mobile, chuckling and throwing out jokes to these guys. And it was so cool to see the smile on his face. He was really in his element. I mean, he has a neat sense of humor. I asked one of my friends who was there, understood Polish, what did he say? He said, I just made a pun and just a play on words. It doesn't translate well, but he had these priests in stitches. It was awesome. And he really felt at home with them and so unguarded. It was really neat. I got this great picture of John Paul, like I said, leaning out the window of his Pope mobile, John with these guys, and then they gathered for a big picture. But I got to stay on property with the Pope that day, a couple of days actually, in central Poland in '99, and then in 2000, I went to Rome for Faustina's canonization and had another audience with the Pope. I started feeling like the Catholic Forrest Gump. I got to meet the Pope again.
Wow.
So Yeah, it was a great blessing. And then, so each time I went to Rome, though, I would go to the papal audience, and Wednesday morning, the Pope, even Benedict and Francis, they do this every, well, not now during the lockdown, but the Wednesday audience, St. Peter's Square. John Paul had a tradition of blessing the sick, and they would bring these sick people in wheelchairs and sometimes even in gurneys in front of them, and he would bless them and chat with them briefly. And then that was followed by a parade of newlyweds, the sposi novelli in Italian. And he would bless. So he's getting this wave of sick people. Then he's getting this wave of young newlyweds, right? And so there's so much joy there, and you could see the joy on the bride and the groom's face, and the Pope's face, that this really brought him great joy. So I saw that, and I remember saying to myself, I want that. I really want that. If I meet the right woman one day, this is what I desire, to be blessed by John Paul II and start my married life that way. And so so 2000, he canonized Faustina. I was in Rome. And at about 6-8 months later, I met her. I literally met her on AveMariaSingles.com. And so we met. Yeah.
Did I miss something here? Wait, you met Saint Faustina Kowalska?
No, I met her.
You met her, the girl, the lady, your future wife,
the lady of my dreams. So about 8 months after Faustina's canonization, it was January, still in the Jubilee year. It's funny, God gives you this sense. I just had this sense that I would meet my future wife in the Jubilee year, and it was literally within the waning days of it, because I think the Jubilee year ended like January 18th, and I met her on January 4th or 5th. But anyway, so
where's she from?
Yeah, she's from Michigan. She was born in Michigan, and so we started our married life in Michigan. I can get to that, but so while we were courting, she knew that I had met the Pope, and she knew that she had some friends who had gone to Rome and gotten blessed by the Pope in their wedding clothes, and she said, if we get married, wouldn't it be cool if we went to Rome and got blessed by the Pope too? And I'm like, yeah, it would. Okay, Lord, I need no further confirmation. This is the girl. This is the girl. And she was. We've been married 18 years, and matter of fact, just a couple of days ago, we celebrated the 18th anniversary of meeting John Paul II in the square. That was the 5th time. So this whole long story I'm telling you, this is the last time I met John Paul II was with my wife.
Oh, nice, beautiful. So then, now let me ask the shameless question that might be uncomfortable. I mean, did you name one of your children Therese because she had something to say? Teresa had something to do.
Well, my mother's name is Teresa. She's named after the little flower. So
that doesn't count. You had nothing to do with it. You had nothing to do with that, Patrick.
Yeah. No, I have one daughter, and no Therese or Teresa in there.
All right. Well, you had to go along with what your wife wanted to. That shows you're a good guy. So I guess that I won't go any deeper because it might lead to other embarrassing questions. Anyway, no, but that's fine. But listen, while we're on the topic of those visits, and you were in Poland, did tell us about? I mean, there's so many incredible chapters in this book. One of which has to do with Lady Czestochowa, the Black Madonna.
Yeah.
Tell us about the Lady of Czestochowa, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Please correct me.
Yeah, it's Czestochowa.
Czestochowa, okay.
Yeah. So Our Lady of Czestochowa, people might know the Black Madonna. So the Black Madonna is, legend has it that it is Our Lady's kitchen table, and that St. Luke, while he was chatting with Our Lady, painted this icon on their cedar kitchen table. So that's a legend. Now, legends usually have some grain of truth, but that's the legend of Our Lady of Czestochowa. Anyway, this image is housed at the Jasna Gora Monastery in Czestochowa, Poland. John Paul II, as a young man, I mean, every Polish person, almost bar none, who's Catholic, makes a pilgrimage to. It's the most revered icon in all of Poland and almost in all of Europe. and John Paul II, when he was still a young man, when he was a young priest, would make regular pilgrimages to Our Lady of Czestochowa, to the Black Madonna, and his devotion to Our Lady started, as a young man. But when his mother died when he was 9 years old, his father took him to, I think it was to Czestochowa, and he said, "She's your mother now." And that really gave him this profound, powerful devotion to Mary. And when he became Pope, he went did his first trip back to Poland in '79, which was monumental. Really, the first crack in the Iron Curtain happened in June of '79 when John Paul went back to Poland for the first time as Pope. But he would come there, and he said this. He said he called the monastery a shrine of great hope, where so many times I had whispered "Totus tuus," which means "totally yours," in prayer before that image. So he really poured out his heart to Mary, the Mother of Christ, and found great comfort in her presence, her mystical presence in that shrine. And as a matter of fact, I noticed this when I went to Mass in his private chapel in the papal apartments at the Vatican. He had an icon of Our Lady of Czestochowa at the foot of the cross, at the altar, on the wall, in his private chapel. And so when I went to Krakow for the first time, I bought an identical one, and I have it on my wall right in front of me, and had the entire time I was writing my book as an inspiration.
It's incredible. One can say that his papacy was born in Jasna Gora.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was certainly nurtured there by his devotion to Mary, for sure.
Well, okay. So there's so many questions I want to ask you, but one of which is, of course, I want you to go a little deeper on the intensity of his Marian devotion. Tell us about that, please, Patrick.
Yeah. So, John Paul II, as I said earlier, when his mother died, he was 9 years old, and his father said, this is now your mother. So I think what happened was that he nurtured his Marian spirituality all through his life, but I think that was his mother's passing was kind of a key to that. But even going back a step further, when he was in school, he would put at the top of his papers, he'd put "To Jesus through Mary," or JMJ, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph, on the top of every corner of the paper. And a lot of Catholics do this now. It's a pious devotion to Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. And JMJ, if you see that, you know that it's Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. It's just the devotion to the Holy Family. And he had that as a very young man. But I really think that it was his devotion to Mary was really exploded when he started reading St. Louis de Montfort's book, To Mary, his total consecration to Mary. That really kind of exploded in John Paul, in Karol Wojtyła, his passion for Our Lady. Now, most people don't know this, but the papal coat of arms, every pope has their own coat of arms that they have. It's kind of like a shield. And for John Paul, when he was made a bishop in 1958, he created a coat of arms, and he put the M. So the M for Mary in his coat of arms is for Our Lady, and he kept the same coat of arms as a bishop, as archbishop, as cardinal, as pope. He didn't change it. Some people, when they're elected pope, they'll come up with a new coat of arms. He kept the same one, and I think Francis and Benedict did the same thing. But the M for Mary dates back to 1958 when he became a bishop. So his devotion to Our Lady goes back a very long way, back to high school and even before that. Another thing that a lot of people don't know is that Cardinal Wojtyła was one of the youngest bishops at the Second Vatican Council. At the beginning, nobody really knew who he was. I think he would have been, so he was born in 1920. This is 62. So how's my math? He was
41 years.
41, 42.
42.
Yeah, yeah. At the beginning of the council, he tried to convince the bishops to include a separate conciliar document on the Blessed Mother, and they didn't. But it was that language was incorporated into Lumen Gentium, which is another document that came out of the council. But he became a very influential figure by the end of the council 4 years later, and had played a huge part in shaping the direction of the council. And I think that's really where he got the. Well, he wrote a number of the documents, co-wrote a number of the documents. He played an important role in developing the text on religious freedom, the vocation of the laity, drafted the pastoral constitution on the modern world. These are very key, that was a very key document of the council. And then not only that, but after he became Pope, he really spent his pontificate unpacking the council. As most Catholics know, Catholics who are paying attention, the unpacking of the council by Paul VI, it didn't work very well. Paul VI had a lot on his plate, and I think he was unprepared for the cultural changes that happened in the 60s and 70s, and his attempt to roll out the teachings of the council were not effective. But John Paul, when he was elected in 78, he understood the council very well because he was there. He understood it. He helped write a lot of these documents. So he spent his 26 and a half years as Pope unpacking the council. In almost every speech he gave and in almost every document he wrote, he referred back to the council and kind of pulled it apart and said, this is what the council meant. This is where the church is going. This is what the Holy Spirit is saying to the church in the modern age. And it was genius. It took a long time, and there's still more of the council that needs to be unpacked. But I think the church is where it is today, on pretty firm footing for people in the church to understand the council. Not finished yet, and not to say the church is completely perfect, but as far as the intent of the council, I think John Paul really showed that as Pope John the 23rd said, that we need to open the windows of the church and let the fresh air come in and let the Holy Spirit guide the church into the 21st century. And that's really what John Paul saw as his task. He had an intense prayer life. I really believe that everything he accomplished in his papacy, every good work that he was able to do, came from a deep and profound prayer life. People who saw him pray, and even myself, it's like he's not there. It's like he's gone into another world. He just, he emptied himself out in front of the Lord and allowed God to really use him. This is what I mean by that. Mother Teresa, this is my favorite Mother Teresa quote. She said, "I'm a little pencil in the hand of God writing a love letter to the world." Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that she doesn't take credit for anything she did. She's just a pencil. God is the one doing the work. He's the one moving her to do whatever God wants to do. And John Paul II did the same thing. When he went to prayer, he emptied himself out and said, "I'm all yours, Lord. Totus tuus," that means Mary, I'm all yours. Take me to your son. Let him what's the word I'm looking for? Let him empower me to do whatever is God's will. And for John Paul, prayer was a conversation. He was a mystic. Everyone that knew him well would testify that he had mystical experiences, and that he would his prayer was like I said, it was like a nuclear explosion, that God was so alive in him. in his prayer life, and that's what empowered him to accomplish the great things that he did in his time as a priest and bishop and pope.
Right. So then, now, what is it about Saint John Paul II and your investigations of him that you found especially surprising? Anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, I think so. A number of things. I grew up in John Paul's papacy. I was 10 years old when he was elected. So he really was my pope. I don't remember Paul VI. Even though he was pope, 6 months earlier, a couple of months earlier before John Paul was elected. What surprised me. So okay, here we go. So the mainstream media, the Catholic media, I think covered John Paul really well, but they could not cover everything that he did and everything that he said. Otherwise, it would be wall-to-wall, 24-hour news cycle like we have today, which we didn't have back in the 70s and 80s. So John Paul had a really profound outreach and pastoral ministry to the people of Africa. He visited about three quarters of the countries in Africa. He wrote. He had an apostolic synod on Africa. Wrote a document that came out of that called Ecclesia in Africa. And instead of presenting that document in Rome, as these documents typically are, he went to Africa. I think it was in Cameroon, the capital city of Cameroon, and he presented the document there. He unveiled it there.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he appointed far more African bishops than any of his predecessors. He appointed Africans to very high positions, including Cardinal Lorenze, to very high positions in the Roman Curia. He really helped to grow the church's apostolic outreach to the continent, and we're starting to see the fruits of that. I mean, who doesn't know an African priest who's in the United States doing parish work? I mean, they're everywhere.
Oh, yeah, sure.
I live in Southwest Florida, and we have African priests coming through here all the time. And that is because of John Paul II.
John Paul II vocations. Is it accurate to say?
Yeah, and well, that and just the spark of, and not just vocations, but families alive in the faith and young people on fire for Jesus in the Catholic Church. That's the fruit of John Paul II's outreach to Africa. When I was a kid, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, there were a lot of Polish priests that came to the United States and Canada, and we get a lot of these Eastern European priests. But now there are waves and waves of African priests, and that's the fruit of his work in the 80s, because these were young kids. These new priests were young kids when John Paul was going to Africa. He was enlivening the church in Africa, kind of lighting a fire there. I talked about in Eastern Europe these priests that kept the embers alive behind the Iron Curtain. Well, John Paul came into Africa and he started blowing on those embers, and the church is really on fire in Africa because of John Paul II. So that was one thing that surprised me.
Extraordinary.
And part of that is because, we just don't get a lot of news about Africa in the United States. It doesn't seem to be that important, even in
it's a developing continent.
Yeah.
And it's not it's unfair to say it's just really third world. I think it's a developing continent.
Yeah, absolutely. And so here's another one, though. He also had a profound outreach to China. He never visited China. He wanted to, but the Chinese government is not really that open to the Catholic Church. But still, he had diplomatic outreach constantly to Beijing. Every time he would go to neighboring countries, he would broadcast messages to the Chinese people. So had a real heart for China as well, and nurtured the faith of the people in the underground church.
How's that?
There.
He broadcast messages. In other words, when he went to I don't know neighboring countries, his message would be broadcast to reach China, or what?
Yeah.
Or
South Korea. When he went to Japan, to Korea, to India, he would broadcast messages into China, in Chinese.
Oh, well, that's amazing. I never knew that. I think a lot of people would agree with me that this is totally new and something that nobody realizes this. I mean, maybe a very small percentage, but That's extraordinary.
Yeah,
We don't think of him as an Oriental focused pope.
yeah. I mean, he saw his mission as bringing Jesus to the entire planet, to all of humanity, not just to Catholics, not just he had a profound outreach to the ecumenical. He had an ecumenical outreach that was unprecedented. He gathered religious leaders of all faiths in Assisi once a year for a number of years, and I think Francis and Benedict continued that outreach as well. Just not that he necessarily wanted to convert all these people to Catholicism. That wasn't the point. It was to dissolve enmity, to build bridges of dialogue and understanding and trust, and those things lead to peace. And Saint Francis, known as the saint of peace, he kind of saw Saint Francis as that conduit to other faiths, where people of no matter what faith have great respect for St. Francis. So in order to build peace among various faith communities, Catholic and non-Catholic, and whether you're Muslim, Hindu, whatever, John Paul wanted to be the guy that brought these people together to have peace, to have understanding, to have dialogue, to have conversation. So and it was genius. It was genius. He was criticized by some Catholics for it, but
sure.
I think
he kissed the Quran. I guess that's a little bit like kissing the knife that's going to chop your head off, right?
So that was probably one of the most controversial things that John Paul did, and I do address that in my book as well. He was the first pope to go to go into what's the Muslim church called? Help me out here. A mosque. Thank you. First pope to visit a mosque. He did kiss the Quran. Now, there's no official explanation why he did that. Some people saw it as a betrayal. Others interpreted it as a gesture of peace toward his guests who presented it to him. But his intent was not to cause scandal. His intent was to improve Catholic relations with Islam.
I was going to say, listen, we all know that the church grows fruitful thanks to among other things, the martyr's blood. And so many martyrs have come to our Lord through the vicious cruelty of Islam, in the sense that he's kind of thanking the Quran for bringing so many martyrs into the fold of Christ,
Yeah, perhaps. Perhaps. I don't think that was his intent. But John Paul II was no dumb. He was no dummy. He had no illusions about the Muslim religion. He said this is 2 weeks after 9/11. He was visiting Kazakhstan, and he said this: "I invite both Christians and Muslims to raise an intense prayer to the one Almighty God, whose children we all are," and just essentially called for peace. He said there's no room for hatred or discrimination or violence. But he also said that Islam is not a religion. This is a direct quote. He said, "Islam is not a religion of redemption. There's no room for the cross and the resurrection." So, he really understood that Islamic faith is very distant from Christianity. And he, but at the same time, he wanted peace. After 9/11, he was the first to call for peace between the United States and not to have war over 9/11, to have more dialogue. And but he also understood that once there was a war going on, that it needed to be over as quick as possible. So sure. That's all in the book as well.
So something that I really have to touch on, because I think it's fundamental to who he was, let's say John Paul II, who he is now in heaven, is his devotion to the Eucharist. Tie that into us. How did he express that? How did he express his devotion to the Eucharist?
Wow.
And then does the rosary tie in with that? Does the rosary tie in with that?
Yeah, I think so. He drew his strength from the Blessed Sacrament. His prayer life was really fueled by the Blessed Sacrament. I mean, from the time he was a very young man, even before he was a priest, people would find him lying prostrate in front of the Blessed Sacrament, in front of the tabernacle, quite often in cruciform fashion, on his face with his arms spread out, just lying there, and they would think he fell asleep, but he was just praying. And that was part of his mystical prayer. It was really, it's hard for people who don't have that kind of intensity to understand. But he wrote an encyclical on the Eucharist, and he said it's obviously a great mystery. He declared this is the other thing he did. 2004, 2005, he declared that the year of the Eucharist, it actually was going on when he died in 2005. He said the Eucharist is a great mystery, and it's one which above all must be well celebrated. So the Mass needs to be set at the center of Christian life and celebrated in a dignified manner by every community. So he really insisted that he urged the faithful, particularly priests, to know Jesus better by spending time with him in front of the Blessed Sacrament, especially after Mass. And this is a neat thing too, that before he became Pope, he attended two of his excursions out of Poland as bishop. He attended two international Eucharistic congresses as Pope. One was in Australia, one was in Philadelphia. As a matter of fact, that's where he met Mother Teresa for the first time. Both of them were in Philadelphia in 1976, the bicentennial year of the United States, at a Eucharistic Congress. And so their friendship developed from that point on. They both had this passion for the faith that was really unmistakable.
Well, let's see. I'm glad you mentioned that term, passion for the faith, because we live in a time where there's in many parts of the country, the United States at least, in the Western world, there's a lukewarmness for the faith, and so I think our Holy Father really was moved by intense love for the faithful. For example, in Africa, had such an incredible impact later on, the interaction of St. John Paul II in Africa and the African faithful. But also, how did he react to modern, let's say, recent apparitions or alleged apparitions that haven't really been approved by the church? It comes to mind, Medjugorje.
Yeah.
What was his take? What was his impression of all the block long lines of confession, people going, having their lives transformed, because marriages renewed, tremendous positive changes. What was his reaction? What was the reaction to that?
Yeah, well, we have to first understand that John Paul was the Marian Pope. He had a great devotion to Our Lady from a very young age, which we already discussed. And he, when he was shot in 1981, it was on the feast of Our Lady of Fatima. And it was May 13th in 1981. He gave credit to Mary, the Mother of God, for saving his life. The doctor said, and this is a professional assassin. I mean, this guy had killed before. And in the interviews with him, he was shocked that the Pope didn't die. I mean, this is a guy who knew what he was doing. He wasn't just some random guy shooting from the crowd. So if that bullet would have been just a few millimeters one way or the other, it would have killed him. It was that close. So John Paul said, one hand fired the bullet, another hand guided the bullet. He gave credit to Mary for guiding the bullet, sparing his life. So when he made his next pilgrimage a year later, literally a year later, May 13th of 1982, he was in Fatima. He had that bullet welded into the crown of Mary in Fatima, at the shrine of Fatima, and it's there to this day, the bullet that almost took his life. And so, we've established that John Paul is a great devotee of Our Lady, great passion for Our Lady. He declared a Marian year. He gave us 5 new mysteries of the Rosary. So there's no questioning that. So when in 1981, reports surfaced that Our Lady was appearing to children in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the world was captivated. The Pope got regular reports. he allowed the process to play out, and this happens every time that there's an apparition or an alleged apparition. The local bishop is in charge of authenticating the apparition, whether it's true or not. And so the local bishop established a commission, investigated, and several bishops have had several investigations. And the official ruling to this day is that it's neither approved nor condemned, but further study is needed to determine whether something supernatural is present. So leaving it at that, John Paul knew all of this. He never said anything publicly about Medjugorje. We know that he was intrigued by it, obviously being Marian Pope, having a passion for the Slavic people, being one himself, that he really wanted that, but he didn't want to interfere. He didn't want to put his fingerprint on this before the church officials knew that it was real or not real. But we do know through Cardinal Stanislav Dziwisz was John Paul's longtime personal secretary. His secretary while he was Archbishop of Krakow and stayed with him all the way through to his death. Bishop Dziwisz, it's funny, people ask me, well, you met the Pope 5 times, so did he remember you? I'm not sure that he did, but Cardinal Dziwisz did. Every time I met John Paul, Dziwisz knew exactly who I was. He may not have remembered my name, but he knew who I was affiliated with. He remembered my face. Oh, wow. He knew me. So Cardinal Dziwisz wrote a book about his life with John Paul II, and he says that the Pope didn't receive the visionaries in an audience because out of prudence. We don't know whether they are true visionaries or not, or whether the apparitions are legit. But he did note that the Pope was really deeply impressed by the abundant spiritual fruits that Medjugorje was able to unleash. And I'm not sure if you've been there, but I went there in the fall of 1996. I went to Medjugorje. I came from there just on a cloud, and I prayed the rosary every day for several years in a row after coming out of Medjugorje. Now, I don't know if it's real or not. I'm leaving that to the prudence of the bishops and the church to determine. If they say yes, it's real, I'll believe it. If they say it's not, I'm okay with that. Sure. But I know that there are people who've had profound experiences. I met the visionaries, and they were very nice people. So I'll leave it at that. John Paul really didn't put his fingerprint on that at all. But it is notable that in 1997, John Paul went to Sarajevo, which is like 95 miles away from Medjugorje, and he didn't mention Medjugorje at all. He didn't visit. So that says prudence, right? Had he gone there, had he said something about it, people would have taken that as his stamp of approval when it wasn't really his to give yet.
I mean, he deferred to the local bishop, I think. Which I think
absolutely. Absolutely.
And if you had to say one thing, what was his greatest contribution, John Paul II's greatest contribution to the Catholic Church? What do you think it would be?
Gosh, there are a couple of things that I need to mention. And I'll start with, I'll go in order of, I think, of importance here. John Paul II, when he was a young man, his country was invaded by the Nazis. Germany invaded Poland, took over Poland, Second World War. It was devastating. He saw his friends, Jewish friends and Catholic friends, hauled off to concentration camps, people's fathers murdered. It was a great time of a tragic time for the Polish people. So he saw this totalitarian regime come in, and then after the Second World War was over, it was replaced by the communists, the Soviets, and this other greatly flawed ideology taking over his homeland. So he understood it from the inside very well when he became Pope in 1978. And he had a like-minded brother from another mother and another country in Ronald Reagan. Most people don't know this, but when John Paul went to Poland for the first time in 1979, that like I said this earlier in our conversation, that was the first crack in the Iron Curtain. That eventually took 10 years for the Iron Curtain to fall. June of 79, the news was all over the world that John Paul II came as this conquering hero to his homeland less than a year after being elected. It was like 6-7 months.
Stunning.
And one of the people that saw the news reports was none other than former governor of California, Ronald Reagan. Reagan saw this, and people that know Reagan and know his history, he was one of the most fierce anti-communist commentators in the United States, by far. Both as governor, he was president of the Screen Actors Guild, he had radio programs, he had TV programs. He and Fulton Sheen were all over the airwaves talking about the errors of communism. So he saw John Paul II coming into Poland like this. He said, that's the key. That's the key to bringing down Soviet communism. And he went on the air. He broadcast radio programs after that, talking about John Paul II, talking about communism in Eastern Europe, and talking about how this Pope is the one who's going to end the Cold War. And a few years later, Reagan became president of the United States. One of the first people he wanted to meet was John Paul II. And they struck up a very fast friendship. And it became very clear that they were very like-minded and had this in mind. So long story short, these two men, their collaboration, they shared intelligence, they shared strategy, they both were men of deep prayer. And in the fall of 1989, the Berlin Wall fell and history was made. There's so much more about this. I highly recommend the book A Pope and a President by Paul Kengor. He also wrote the foreword from my book. Phenomenal story of how this Polish Pope and the American Protestant president collaborated to bring down communism in Eastern Europe. One of John Paul's huge contributions to humanity, Western civilization. Second, most people don't know this either, but when John Paul was a young man, he was 18 years old, he and his father moved from Wadowice, where he was born and raised, to Krakow so that he could start university. His mother had already died 9 years earlier. So on his way into Krakow, he passed this convent where a young nun named Faustina Kowalska lived. Just a few months after John Paul moved to Krakow, Faustina died. Now, who was Faustina? Faustina Kowalska was a young nun. She died of tuberculosis in 1938. She had visions of Jesus appearing to her from around 1930 to near the end of her death, so all through the 1930s. And one of the things that Jesus said to her was that, I want you to prepare the world for my second coming. And she asked that the second Sunday of Easter be called Divine Mercy Sunday. And she said, I want you to paint an image, have an image painted the way you see me, with one red ray and one blue ray emanating from Jesus' heart. That's what we call today the Divine Mercy image. So John Paul didn't know Faustina, but shortly after she died, the Second World War came. She had written all of her visions in a diary. And because of the Iron Curtain, they weren't able to really authenticate her writing. So the church in Rome said, no more spreading divine mercy of this Sister Faustina. And so in 1968, Karol Wojtyła, then Cardinal Archbishop of Krakow, told his top theologian, I want you to study her diary and kind of look into it and see if there's anything to it. Well, it took him 10 years. But in the ensuing time, John Paul opened her canonization process in 1965, and 6 months to the day that John Paul, 6 months, so he take a step back. This theologian studied her diary, authenticated it, sent it to Rome, and in the spring of 1978, Rome approved her diary, her message, and 6 months to the day after that, John Paul was elected Pope. So one of his greatest contributions was authenticating Sister Faustina's diary, promoting her message of divine mercy, fulfilling Jesus' request demand really that the second Sunday of Easter be called Divine Mercy Sunday, and that people understand that this is a time to implore God for his mercy on the world as we're getting closer. Every day we're a day closer to when Jesus comes back. So massive contribution to the Catholic Church, to the world, because this message isn't just for Catholics, it's for everyone.
Well, you're running out of time, but I'm not. So I have another question.
So that's two. I said I'd give you three.
Okay.
But literally everything that John Paul II did, whether it was establishing World Youth Day, whether it was declaring a Eucharistic year, a year of Mary, giving us 5 new mysteries of the Rosary, giving us the Divine Mercy message, all of that was about evangelization. Paul VI, his predecessor, said that the church exists to evangelize. Jesus gave us the Great Commission. The first thing Jesus said when he started his public ministry when he's calling his disciples, he said, come and see. Come and see. It's an invitation to get to know the Lord. The last thing he said was, go out and make disciples of all the world and baptize them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That Great Commission, that's evangelization. Bringing people to Jesus, helping them to come into right relationship with him. And John Paul II knew that. And he was empowered to do that and to do the amazing things he did through his prayer life. But in the 90s, he called for a new evangelization. He said it's time to devote all of the church's energies to this new evangelization. And the new evangelization, I'm getting tongue-tied here. The new evangelization is just the old evangelization, but doing it with greater passion, doing it with newer methods, with newer zeal, bringing the message of using methods of modern technology, the internet, whatever, to bring the gospel message to a world that has maybe sort of seen it, didn't understand it, rejected it, and moved on. We live in a world that's very confused, very hurting, very lonely, very isolated, especially now under lockdown and coronavirus. People are really hungry for the truth. We're not getting the truth from Hollywood. We're not getting the truth from our news media. And we need to get the truth from the Catholic Church. We need to get the truth from people who know Jesus Christ. And John Paul II put great emphasis on evangelization. And going back to what we said earlier, that's why we're getting great fruit out of Africa right now, is because of John Paul's evangelical efforts, evangelical outreach to Africa. And we see that in Denver, the World Youth Day in 1993. Great spiritual fruits came out of Denver. Every place he went, he called people back to the church. He called people back to Jesus. He called people back to the Eucharist to get to know Christ better and to be transformed by him. And I think that's his greatest contribution, is his emphasis on Jesus Christ.
And it behooves us now with the new media to reach out like he did. He was amazing. He was just a globetrotter.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
So much vitality. Yeah. And I want to ask you something about the. I remember a little story. Maybe you've heard it, maybe you haven't. But Jaruzelski, who was Poland's leader. I don't know if the term was prime minister or not, but basically it's the communist leader. And Brezhnev had a very, very apparently testy fight over John Paul II as Pope. And,
Go ahead. Finish your thought.
I was going to say that supposedly Brezhnev said this Pope cannot come, and he said, "Well, Chairman Brezhnev, he's Polish."
Yes,
he's one of our people,
yes.
and that to me is just profound. I mean, it's just what I think is marked in the life of John Paul II. Saint John Paul II, all he did was his humanity and his intense love of God and God's immense, inscrutable plans for humanity, and at the same time, his absolute desire to protest and lay down his life for the sake of the world, but also for his beloved Poland, which moved him so much. And to bring down, and you think about this, I want to go back a little bit, if I can, before his papacy, to the great communist new city for the new man, the Noah Huta, and his struggle to build a parish church there, which is epic. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how it brought down communism?
Yeah, so the Soviet government wanted to build this new city, Nova Huta, the new town, the new city, and they were going to build it without a church. There was going to be a city in Poland without God, and the Polish people, it was just going to be factories and housing and very bland, and the Polish people wanted to have nothing to do with it. So as a young bishop, Karol Wojtyła engaged in a public effort to defend religious liberty, and he fought for 20 years to build a church in a suburb of Krakow. It was supposed to be this workers' paradise, but far from a paradise. I mean, how can you have a paradise without God? Even under communism, the people's faith, the Polish people's faith, could not be extinguished. And he knew that. So he did end up building this church and consecrated the church in 1977, less than a year before, just about a year before he became the Bishop of Rome. Persevered. The people would put up a cross on this land where they wanted to build the church, and the communists would tear it down. They put up another cross and they'd tear it down. They would gather on this patch of dirt and they would have mass out in the open. They'd put up a little table. They put up a cross. They leave. The communists would tear it down. But they kept coming back. And eventually, because
they
of
do it
John
on Christmas
Paul's...
too.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But because of John Paul's perseverance, they built that church. And this is a great quote, that when he consecrated this church in 1977, he said this: "Man in history cannot be reckoned by economic principles alone. Even according to the most exacting rules of production and consumption, man is greater than this. He is in the image and likeness of God." And so, he was relentless, he was fearless, and he changed the world. He literally changed the world. And, when I look at his life, I study his life, I wrote this book, if each and every one of us allows God, like I said, be this little pencil that God can move around and do what he wants to do with you. You surrender and let God do the moving, and you're just the instrument. You're going to change the world. I really think my book is going to change the world. I really wanted this to be a book that unpacked John Paul's legacy in a unique way. It's really 100 short essays. Each of these 100 ways is only a page and a half. So it's a short book, but it really drills into his greatest areas of influence and gives us some of his greatest quotes, some of his greatest accomplishments. And I wrote it for two audiences. One is for young people who were little kids or not even born when John Paul died in 2005. My daughter was like a month before she was born. He died. So she's 14, going on 15 now. She has no lived experience of John Paul II. Our people going into college and university right now, they were little babies when John Paul was born. When John Paul died in 2005. So they have no lived experience of him. So really, I wrote this book for them so that they can read this you can read it in one sitting. Take a couple hours and read this book, and you'll understand John Paul II.
It's a great book to read. It's like that old potato chip commercial. Bet you just can't eat one.
Yeah, there you go.
Bet you just can't read one, because that's fantastic reading. And the one thing I wanted to mention is that he had this. He would have very big masses on Christmas Eve, and the authorities would come in the bitter cold of a Polish winter. He's having an outdoor mass on Christmas Eve, and they would come, and they would, and he was implacable. And then when was it that communism fell? It was
when communism fell.
Yes, there's a specific formal act of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And it happened.
Yeah, I think that
Go ahead.
was it 89. I think it was
I think
89.
I think it was 1990 or 1991, and it happened on
Okay.
Christmas.
Christmas. Yeah.
So
Yeah,
now,
I think you're right.
And now, which leads to the question. I mean, he'd love to do outreach. He wanted to get through the stone concrete walls of communism, like Reagan did. But he had outreach that he used in so many ways. One of which, of course, was diplomacy. Tell us about what he did regarding Russia and diplomacy to Russia and trying to break through to the incredible opposition to Catholic Christian teaching and the dignity of man in the Soviet Union.
Yeah, that's one of, when you talk about some of the things that surprised me, I had no idea. I knew that one of his greatest disappointments was that he never had the chance to visit Russia. He actually did, and most people don't know this either, that Boris Yeltsin and Mikhail Gorbachev both invited John Paul II to visit Russia. But this is after the fall of the Soviet Union. But he knew that he couldn't do that without having the approval of the Russian Orthodox Church, simply because one of his greatest passions was to build bridges with other Christian traditions, primarily the Orthodox Church. The first split in Christianity came in the 11th century. I think it was 1070 AD, when the Orthodox Church split from Rome, Constantinople. And from that, we get the Russian Orthodox Church being the biggest of the Eastern Orthodox churches. John Paul saw that his passion for visiting Russia came second to his passion for
love of Russian Orthodoxy and the Russian Christian community.
No question.
That's amazing. How did that play out, though, Patrick? Did he do a lot of important spade work with
he did
leaders in the West?
He did. Well, obviously he won over Gorbachev and Yeltsin because they wanted him to come to Russia pretty bad. But his outreach to the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church didn't bear a whole lot of fruit. But when his successor was appointed, there was some movement. So I'm not sure if people know this, but his successor is Patriarch Kirill, and he met with Pope Francis in person in 2016. Very first time a pope and a patriarch ever met. That was because of the groundwork done by John Paul II.
Do you know anything about this?
So there is a...
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I was going to finish your thought, please.
So there's a great thaw happening between Orthodoxy and Rome, and I believe that within my lifetime, maybe within even the next 10 years, we'll see a pope visiting Russia, and that would not have happened if not for the tremendous diplomatic and pastoral outreach of John Paul II.
Yes, it's this extraordinary thing. I mean, he spoke many languages. How many languages was he able to speak, Patrick?
He spoke, depending on the source, between 11 and 13 languages fluently. He could get by in probably another dozen. But on his last Urbi et Orbi blessing, Christmas of, I want to say, the 2004, Easter of 2004, he gave a blessing in 65 languages. Now, he read them. He read them. He understood them, but fluent, at least a dozen.
Amazing. So tell me about John Paul II and his views concerning the end times. You mentioned Saint Faustina Kowalska and her writings, that our Lord wanted her to be someone kind of like a messenger for the end times. The second coming.
Yeah.
What did he have to? Tell us about that.
Well, we can't talk about John Paul in the end times without mentioning Fatima, Divine Mercy, Saint Faustina. In John Paul's second encyclical, which is called Divas in Misericordia, Rich in Mercy, he urges all of us, the faithful, to implore God's mercy for humanity and to beg for God's mercy in this phase of the history of the Catholic Church, understanding that when Jesus appeared to Faustina, he said, your job is to prepare the world for my second coming. Now is the time for mercy. So John Paul understood that perhaps Jesus wasn't going to return, within his lifetime. But, I always tell people that the end of the world is when you take your last breath, that's the end of the world. Or
Absolutely.
whether you see Jesus coming in the clouds in all his glory, like he said he would, and he will, or you take your last breath and you see him for your preliminary judgment, doesn't matter. That's the end of the world for you, no matter who you are. And each of us is going to meet him and have to give an account. But he just knew that it was his job to read the signs of the times and to interpret what the Holy Spirit was saying. This is an interesting quote. And by the way, in this book, in the researching this book, I found a lot of things that John Paul allegedly said. But many of them had no sources. Many of them didn't point back to where they got this from or when he said it, in what context he said it. I only included quotes that I could authenticate that he actually said that had a source. So here's something that he said in 1976 at the Eucharistic Congress in Philadelphia. It was reported in the Wall Street Journal in 1976. We talked about that a little bit earlier, but here's the quote. I'm reading it to you now. It said, "We are standing in the face of the greatest historical confrontation humanity has gone through. I do not think that in wide circles of the American society or wide circles of the Christian community fully realize this. We are now facing the final confrontation between the church and the anti-church, of the gospel versus the anti-gospel, between Christ and the antichrist." Now, that is a powerful statement, and there was an article in that.
Excuse me, definitely an apocalyptic statement too.
Very apocalyptic, very apocalyptic. Now, whether John Paul would have said that as Pope or not, I'm not sure he would have, but he understood that really it's probably, we're probably living in the final era, the final time of the church, of the world. We're probably not going to get another 2,000 years before Jesus comes back. Probably not. So sure. We're in the last part. We're in the final three innings. Now, sure. Whether we're in the ninth inning or the seventh,
I would argue we could be in almost about the bottom of the eighth. But
yeah. That's my sense too.
Listen. No, go ahead.
Now, I also want to talk about something that he said regarding Fatima when he spoke to German bishops in 1980.
Great minds think alike. I was about to ask you about that.
This big thing, and this is on record as Pope, as Supreme Pontiff. He said this. I'll read this again. He said, "We must prepare ourselves to suffer great trials before long. With your and my prayer, it is possible to mitigate this tribulation, but it is no longer possible to avert it, because only thus can the church be effectively renewed. We must be strong and prepared and trust in Christ and his mother, and be very, very assiduous in praying the rosary." So again, it's like Jesus from the cross. He entrusted St. John. He entrusted all of us to his mother. Here is your mother. And he understood that Mary's intercession is the most powerful thing that we can seek in these times of trouble. It's funny, before I got married and had children, I didn't quite get that. But, when my kids feel like they can't come to dad, they go to the mother. And then the mother intercedes to me for the children. And I can't say no to my wife. I just, when it's something wonderful and reasonable, and she's saying, come on, would you please? And I'm like, for you, yeah, of course. So,
it's in the Bible. It's natural.
It's so natural. So natural.
You look at Moses. I mean, God's about to really, like unleash upon the Israelites, and there's Moses counseling God. I mean, talking to God, saying, "You can't do that," trying to reason with him, and he relents. Yeah, and I think they use the word repents of his wrath.
Yeah,
the Israelites. And so the funny thing is, is that, you go to the New Testament, of course, you have Our Lady telling her son pointedly, they have no wine.
Mm.
It's a humiliation for a family, and for the family of the bride, I presume, that paid for it. And so, it's just so human. And so now, concerning his devotion for Our Lady of Fatima, was that something that began early, or did that await him becoming a priest? Because, of course, when he became a priest in, what was it, 1826?
Yeah, yeah.
I would imagine did he know about Fatima? Did he know what Our Lady had said about Russia?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe so. When Fatima was a big deal, and she appeared for the first time May 13th, 1917. It made headlines all over the world. Not immediately, but when you think about the miracle of the sun, there were a huge crowds there. There were reporters from all over Europe, because this was supposed to be the big thing. So given that he had this devotion to Our Lady, I'm pretty sure that early on in his life, became a priest in the what did we say, 1930s?
I think it was 1946. He began studying at the Jagiellonian University in 1941, I believe.
Yeah. So I'm sure that by the time he was a priest, he was very well versed, and he was a scholar. He read everything. So there were times he'd be reading a couple of books at a time. He was genius. So yeah, I'm sure that he knew about Fatima very early on in his life. And interestingly, he became very good friends with Sister Lucia, the one of the surviving visionary, and
Tell us about that.
Visited her a number of times. So Sister Lucia never left Portugal, but every time that John Paul went to visit Fatima, he spent some time with her. And obviously, the big mystery around the 80s was the third secret, right? And so he this, I find this funny, that in when John Paul was shot in May of 1981, he'd been Pope for 3 years, almost 3 years, 2.5 years, and he had access to all the files, everything. It wasn't until he was in his hospital bed that he asked his aides to bring me the third secret of Fatima.
Wow.
Third secret of Fatima
Amazing.
just happened to be about a bishop in white being martyred, right? So here he is, the bishop in white, the Bishop of Rome, having blood all over him, and just finding out, oh yeah, I guess that was, he found out in his hospital bed that he was, yeah. And Sister Lucia said, yeah, the attempted assassination, that satisfies the third secret of Fatima. That's it. There's nothing more. So,
wow.
So yeah, fascinating.
Astonishing.
But
and so when they met, would they meet for hours and hours, or is it just 15 minutes because it's very obviously extremely busy?
Yeah, I think I don't think it was hours and hours, but I think he worked it into his schedule that he could have a pretty good amount of time with her, because because of who she was. And again, I have no doubt that she will be a canonized saint one day. I know her cause is open. The other two have been canonized already. So
we have to do this again, Patrick, and I hopefully we'll be able to. I'd really love to dedicate, several more interviews, but that depends on you, not depends on pushy New Yorkers like me. So Patrick,
I love it. So listen, but before we wrap up, people need to know a couple of dates coming up. May 18th, 2020 is the 100th anniversary of John Paul's birth. And there were supposed to be huge celebrations in Poland, but because of the coronavirus, not sure they're going to happen. But we need to mark that day by asking for this great saint's intercession for our planet, because he understood our modern times very, very well, and he prepared us very well for where we are now. So I wrote an op-ed for Fox News on April 2nd about the 15th anniversary of his death. I'm working on another article that I'll be writing for Fox News on the 100th anniversary of his birth, and also a big spread in our Sunday Visitor, unpacking his legacy. It's a couple of pages, and I'd love to talk to you around that time as the world remembers 100 years of John Paul II.
Wow, what a great commemoration and date, perfect for a book. That happens to be about St. John Paul II. Well, that's good for you. You're that was brilliant. So anyway,
we also have to tell people where they can find the book. So
where can they get it? Where should they go for the book? Patrick,
so the book was supposed to be released around the world on April 2nd, the 15th anniversary of John Paul's death. But because of the virus and the publisher and the printing and all of that was all thrown off schedule. So the book is available right now in ebook form, so Kindle and all the other versions. You can get it at Amazon.com, and I think it's also available at BarnesandNoble.com. But most people are going to Kindle and getting it on Amazon, and so that's where you can get the ebook. The paperback is coming out October 22nd. That's the other important date. That is his feast day, and it's also the first day of his pontificate, 1978. So that gives us 42 years. It'll be 42 years since he became Pope.
Great. Well, that's very serendipitous. Well, good. So tell us again the name of the book. Write it down, folks. The name of the book again.
Here it is. It should be easy to remember. 100 Ways John Paul II Changed the World.
Great. It's a fantastic book. It's an engaging, engrossing read. It's not overly intellectual, but it's highly enriching. So I urge everybody, and Mystic who reads Mystic Post, to share this little interview and to get the book. Yeah. And get it as a great gift. Hopefully it'll be out in paperback form soon.
And let me give you a couple websites. People can follow me on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram. You can find me at my company is called Nova Media, and it's NOVA media.us. Or if you can't remember that, CatholicPublicist.com. Also PatrickNovecosky.com. If you can't spell that, then Google it.
I can. NOVECOSKEY.com. Did I get it right?
Yeah, you got the E. There's no E in there. NOVECOSKY.
Okay, well, good. That was simple. Great. Well, thanks a lot, Patrick.
And I'm pulling together a new website called PatrickWrites.com. WRITES. PatrickWrites.com.
Fantastic. Well, a lot of good stuff will be on there for sure. And so get out there and evangelize, and maybe you can use the ebook to help along the process. So that's fantastic. Well, Patrick, thanks a million for being on Mystic Post TV. We look forward to future contact with you and future interviews about the interesting things that you're doing.
Thank you, Bill. Appreciate the time.
My pleasure. God bless. Bye-bye.
God bless. Bye.